So welcome to Soc 111. So I want to kind of run through an idea of what this is going to look like. We're going to try to have this be as close as possible to a normal class where we have a whiteboard and where I'm writing on the board and we're trying to have a normal lecture. So for our first step of this, who am I? So my name is Tim Bolin. And I have a PhD in education from Chapman University, a master's degree in sociology from San Diego State, as well as a BA from University of Redlands, and that is in Soc and philosophy. So, as far as academic background goes, I spent a lot of time in school. So if y'all have any questions during this semester, feel free to reach out. Broadly interested in things like philosophy and sociology and developing it in education. But I think what's less important when we're talking about sociology is not necessarily what makes us up professionally. So yes, a sociologist does exist in this world of education and academics. But they also exist in this other world, more personal. Personally, a lot of these things, personally what I'm interested in, broadly interested in things art. I like the creative process. Though I've never been an artist per se myself, I've always appreciated it. Specifically things like film and music. I like the black and death metal variety. Usually the more extreme, the better. But as well as ideas of film. I specifically like horror movies. And I like being scared, and I like seeing what different things directors can do with the genre. However, these things don't exist independently from each other. So if we start seeing the personal and the professional, I wouldn't rightly be able to be a sociologist without more than one. Because the personal and professional, of course, influence each other. That my life of death metal, art, and film are influential in how I understand the world professionally. And it's erroneous from the sociologist's perspective to separate these two things. So this goes a larger idea between self and society. That how I view myself influences what comprises society or other people, and that could be family, friends, institutions. These two things influence each other. They're inseparable. At the same time, society is also going to influence how I see myself. That I can't expect to make myself completely without influence, that these things are going to build up and develop who I am. So the questions then of who I am and what sociology are related, and what can these tell us about ourselves. So for instance, with my interest in horror movies, it's getting a bit older now. The example I like to give is this idea of the movie Paranormal Activity. If you remember those movies, it was about a haunting. The idea that a spirit got into someone's house and they were very much afraid of the house itself. If we take a look at these films, it takes place during a time in a social context during the 2008 Great Recession, where there is fear of not being able to stay in your own home, fear of uncertainty. So this idea that our homes themselves were haunted. So our fears, personal fears, are reflected in the social. So we can start seeing then how individual uncertainty can lead to social expression. And sometimes some of the best ways to do so are through a form of art or creative process. That this thing, someone's imagination, and we could draw a little thinking head here. Someone's idea here isn't going to come without social context. This idea up top is clearly coming from a people, and this person interacts with other people, and they all come from different backgrounds. So largely what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be trying to understand how to explore this idea of individuality and see how the social influences us as well. Kind of gets us to this idea of what is sociology. So really, you could see sociology broadly as being how our stories, histories, values interact with each other and are made by society. So like I said before, we're a network of different people, all interacting in a social context. So these are all interaction parts. And this whole thing ends up creating up society itself. So how our own stories, histories, and values. So each one of these people, each one of these individuals, you could imagine this is me, for instance. I have a certain background. I got brought up with a certain type of family. A certain type of perhaps religious beliefs. Certain identity. We'll talk more about that, but identities such as my race, my gender, right? That these things are all going to be things that make up this individual here. And each one of us has these different stories, these different, if you think about a person here, each person is carrying a sort of bag with them. We're coming with baggage, or we're carrying luggage that we're going to take with us and forming society. So sociologists then try to see how all these things interact. Sociologists want to understand how society itself is made up of all these little instances. Whereas then sociology broadly can be which part of this problem do you want to search for? Some sociologists like to look at the big picture, macro, the big idea of society, and see how that interacts with little individuals in society. Other sociologists may be more interested in the micro or small interactions between two people and see how that influences society. So we're all looking at different forms, different vantage points of the overall social picture. But I would also argue, so to what ends? So the big why question. Why are we doing this? Why are we looking at these different things? So I can see two different things, and I think they're related. One of them is understanding society. So we go through each one of these steps, and it's better to understand ourselves, better understand society, better understand the mechanisms. So in some ways you could look at this, and maybe the most simple term is, I want to know the very specific here, like identity, like what my whiteness is going to do and how that interacts with overall social formation. Very specific. I want to understand that component. You know, you come up with the question, how does race reflect in society? Right, that might be a question you look at. Or overall, how do the social forces in the United States, how do the values, beliefs of a whole nation end up affecting each individual? Affect the individual, right? So that's the sub part of understanding society. But again, getting back to this question of why, in my opinion and my argument, I think the biggest part of this is how we could better understand it so we could change society. So if I end up looking at this interaction here, if I'm looking at this question right here, how does race reflect in society? If I start finding something bad here, this is big news now, the idea of how race affects people's ability to get a job, or even maybe affecting their very ability to live in society, to live free. If I end up finding this problem, so if I conclude then that race is a problem, then what, right? So it's not just, for me, it's not just enough to understand the problem, but then to look at the possibility of a solution as well, right? So this idea being, if race is a problem, that's the understanding part, then the solution is what we want to do about that. So I think that's what sociologists could be most interested with. So let's go a little bit deeper then. So specifically, you all are here for marriage and family. So in the marriage and family focus, it could be very broad. And again, it could be separated into the understanding component versus the transformation. So very much understanding could be as simple as which the understanding component could be, what does marriage look like? So who gets married? What does it look like? And for instance, if we were to follow this, what does it look like further? It's maybe a religious ceremony. And for the majority of history, it has been a mostly religious ceremony. But then we identify within this religious ceremony the possibility of exclusion, that some folks aren't able to get married for social values or social reasons. So then we might say, if we're worried about that problem, and then it comes the what. What are we going to do about it? What's the solution? How do we change it? Right? But the main focus that we could see here in the marriage and family is to not only focus on the social, but I think maybe the strongest part of a marriage and family thing is looking specifically at the relationship itself. So marriage and family course could be very focused on this part, the relationship. And here we don't need to necessarily limit it to partners, husband and wife, spouses. It could actually just be any sort of relationship in society. So that'll be the most important part to understand who we are in a broader social context. So for instance, this could just be what defines this relationship. Perhaps this is friends, right? Perhaps this is spouse. Perhaps this is parent and child, right? So the idea then is understanding the relationship itself. We'll be focusing almost entirely on relationships and really extracting everything we can sociologically out of it. So as we identified before, there's at least 3 components to any relationship. We've got the very minimum, at least one individual, right? The second individual. The most important part that comes here is part number 3, is the relationship itself. So we'll find that this could also be more complicated. It could also be an institution. So maybe not only how an individual interacts, but how an individual interacts maybe with like a school as an institution. We'll get into more of that later. But essentially, you've got at least 3 components in each relationship. We're going to break all these down to see how these form, right? Because as always in sociology, our frame is going to be that these may be the 3 components of it, but this always takes place within a society. So we're going to take apart each one of these aspects. One, looking at ourselves as an individual. So when are we going to be looking at self? Concerns for class. Self. We're going to look at the other. Another, again, can be defined by a friend, spouse, etc. Right? And then 3, the relationship itself. What are the dynamics between these two? And then finally 4, how does this, what does this look like socially? So what does this look like socially? So for instance, I am married, and we are in a heterosexual marriage. So if we're to define this as ourselves, here is me, my partner, and then we have a marriage relationship. So we could define this as married, right? So as far as unpacking what this looks like, remember earlier on we talked about we're all bringing things in with us. So for instance, I bring in my race, I bring in my status, I am from divorced parents, I am a teacher, I am a son, right? So you start bringing these things down. And for instance, my partner is Asian. She is also from divorced parents. She is also a teacher. And she is a daughter. 5. Another one you could say is she is an immigrant, right? So if we're imagining then that this is somebody's suitcase, if I could draw a suitcase. If we're to unpack this suitcase then, this suitcase that we each carry with us, we bring baggage with us. Each one of us are bringing certain types, certain beliefs, certain understandings that are going to influence the relationship itself, right? So, and again, this can be done with virtually any partnership that we have, any relationship that we have. If I had a child, I could do the same thing with my child. If I'm talking about myself with my parents, I could talk about myself with my parents. The idea then, identifying the components that bring us up into this context. So, briefly then, if we look at this whole thing, what does this mean in the broader social context? Remember, we're always looking at society. What's the broader social context? An interesting thing we might see here is there's actually a lot of commonalities here, but one thing might be the immigrant status. How does that affect our relationship? Especially defined in an era where immigration is a fraught issue. It's a politically fraught issue. So in the context of contemporary America, though we are defined in a heterosexual way, so there's no deviance there, but the immigrant status of my partner could be something that is an interesting dynamic in our relationship. It's something that's going to affect what we bring to the table. Okay? We're going to look at this in a specific way. We're going to look at this broadly. So if we're talking about relationships then, if we're talking to take relationships seriously, this guy named Martin Buber. So briefly, Martin Buber was a theologian and philosopher, and he was in the context of World War II. Jewish philosopher, Jewish theologian, and after escaping the Nazis in World War II, wanted to go back and to state quite succinctly, I think we need a new form of ethics. What is wrong in our society that ends up causing us to do the things that we do? How can we have such violence and unethical behavior in a society? Right. So, Buber then, thinking theologically, so he is thinking about God, but also more fundamentally, he's not necessarily talking about it in a strictly religious sense. If we draw a little diagram here, which we'll probably be drawing a lot, if we see here, in sociology, this makes this is a very pressing idea. So if this is me, Buber's perspective understands me as being fundamentally connected to the other, and this other could be anybody. It could be teacher, parent, child, whatever. Buber's saying it's this part in the center. The relationship itself literally makes me who I am. So I could not be me. I would not understand who I am without the other person. And to take an example, we could think of parents, right? I would not be who I am without the influence, the guidance, and understanding from my parents. My parents guided me. My parents brought me to different religious practices. My parents told me not to, told me to be polite. All these different things. From the smallest thing about not speaking unless spoken to, not speaking out of turn, to not stealing or not hurting other people. Having values in the United States, having values in education. These things all made me who I am. I literally would not be me without, in this case, my parents. We could also think about this in the sense if we were talking about this other was a child, this other was a partner. That these interactions we have literally make us, right? So, Buber then, if we have nothing else in society, we have this relationship. So the relationship itself is sacred. Right? The relationship is sacred. So this is where he comes up with this phrase, through the thou. So it's not you, it's thou. Through the thou, a person becomes an I. So there's two identifiers here, and it's the relationship itself that makes us, right? So this is the idea I'm gonna try to run with as we go through the term. This idea of relationships as being key to understanding marriage and family in the United States, and even in the world. That we're going to look at the idea of the relationship and understand all the different factors that affect these relationships. What affects relationships? Okay. So to start us off, we're going to go more into Buber as we move forward. One of the first discussion prompts for us to do is to run with this idea, is for us to take an accounting of our own baggage. I'll be drawing this a lot this semester too. So this is my suitcase. And as we say, when I unpack this, I had different things. What am I bringing with me? So what are things that are significant to me that have affected my life? And so one of the first things I think about, at least with the relationships, is I had divorced parents. So it definitely affected my understanding of relationships. I have a strong relationship with my brother. It's a big relationship. My identity as a teacher is a strong thing that I bring with me. My whiteness increasingly becomes an important thing in who I am. My status as a man. My gender becomes something. Cisgender man, specifically. Right. So these sorts of things that I bring with me. And it could even be as simple as things, even just being into metal music, horror movies. All these little things that I'm bringing with me are going to affect the relationships that I get into. They could be big or small. So I want you to take these things and try to unpack it. Try to create one of these for yourself. And maybe at the earliest stage, we'll continue to work on this. Think of a primary relationship in your life, or several, but one might be easier for now. And start thinking about not only what you have with you, but what they do. And start thinking about how this affects your relationship. So think of primary relationship. This could be with anybody. It doesn't have to be family. Primary relationship. Unpack your own. This is the primary focus. A sub one would be think of other. 3, and the final one, how do these affect your relationship? Maybe take about three components and see how they affect this relationship.